Hi, I'm Miss Nexie.
Hi, John White. How are you? Did you see Time Magazine this week? It was a nice piece in Time Magazine.
No, I didn't see it.
John White.
Nice to see you.
I had a campaign.
I'm sorry, what is your name?
In time. God, on many an occasion. Well, we finally got you. We've got a great turnout of students.
Terrific. Well,
Me?
These are all videotaped and they go on local cable stations and all that. So you might even hear from members of your district about this.
oh yeah. I saw Louisa. Where did I see her? I saw her a couple of days ago. I'm going old. I don't remember. Where did I see her? No, it wasn't. Yeah. Oh, no,
Do you have anyone? Just whatever they're seeing is fine. Thank you. Do you want to sit down, John? Next to the podium, probably makes sense. No.
Yeah. Okay. You want to go? Yeah.
Nice of you to shake hands with a has-been first.
Hello,
must be a Del Mayo election.
everyone settle down. Thank you all for coming to this room. Thank you, John F. Kennedy School, for having us. My name is Nick Nyan. I'm Deputy Director for Lead or Leave, which is a national campaign to get younger people back into politics and educate them about their economic future. We have a distinguished panel with us today, and I would like to start by introducing our moderator, Professor John White. He's the director of the Center for Business and Government here. Mr. White has one of the most distinguished records of any American businessman. He's worked at the White House, the Pentagon, and the Rand Corporation. He has advised many institutions: Air Force Academy, Syracuse, Cornell, Wang Laboratories, Eastman Kodak, and the Concord Coalition. Mr. White wrote the last Ross Perot economic plan before Mr. Perot started writing his own. He's very familiar with the topic we're discussing today. He began his involvement in the '92 presidential campaign as an advisor to Mr. Perot and ended up advising the Clinton campaign, which proves that Mr. White knows how to pick a winner. He began serving his country as an officer in the Marine Corps, and he's still serving his country today as one of those who recognizes the importance of business and government to work together and to understand one another. He's one of the leading voices in the country when it comes to charting an economic future. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor John White.
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Kennedy School, I want to welcome you all here. I'm sorry we don't have a larger room because I think this is an exciting topic. This afternoon, as Nick indicated, these are subjects in which I have some views, but I'm going to hold those and turn to our panelists for their views. But let me say that from my perspective, what we're talking about this afternoon is intergenerational morality. I want to introduce the panel. They then will each have about 3 to 5 minutes each to give a short discussion of their own particular views on these issues. We will then have about a 15 to 20 minute discussion among the panelists, and then for the second part of the program, which we're trying to end around 5, we will turn it over to Q&A from the audience so that you can all participate. Let me introduce the panelists in the order in which I'm going to ask them to come forward. First, in the middle is Senator Paul Songus, former senator from Massachusetts and congressman, who, as you know, distinguished himself in his remarkable and wonderful run for President of the United States by telling people exactly the truth and what has to be done. He is also a strong member and founding member of the Concord Coalition. State Treasurer Joe Malone, who has been the Treasurer of the Commonwealth since 1990 and was the first Republican elected to that office in 41 years, is a man who has made a reputation as an aggressive public manager who thinks that government can do more with less. And Congressman Barney Frank, a distinguished and articulate representative of the 4th District of Massachusetts for some 14 years, a long record of accomplishments in Congress, an author of the book Speaking Frankly, which talks about the state of the Democratic Party, and a member of the Budget Committee and an articulate spokesman on these issues, along with a good many others. So with those introductions, let me turn it over to Senator Songus. I'm going to try to keep these gentlemen on schedule so that we can have some participation on your part as well. Paul?
3 minutes?
3 minutes.
Sorry I came. Yeah, the House is 5 minutes. I can spend most of my 3 minutes commenting on the 3 minutes, which may be appropriate. Let me, since there's no time for introductory jokes and all those sort of warming things, let me get right to the issue. And that is the concept of generational morality. The fact is, whether you're Democrat, Republican, liberal, or conservative, that when you all now speaking to the student body, about 15, 18 years from now, you're going to be furious about what my generation left for you to deal with in terms of the lesser nation, in terms of jobs availability, a much more divisive nation, because as this country struggles to understand what multiculturalism is about and bring everybody in, it's going to be much more difficult with a shrinking economic pie than it would have been with an expanding economic pie. When you take 25% of your paycheck out to pay FICA, Social Security, and Medicare, and when an enormous percentage of your federal taxes will go for interest on the debt that my generation gave to you with our best wishes, you're going to be furious. And the fact is, politicians today don't worry about you because the people that vote don't really give a damn about this stuff, Democrats and Republicans. So my job today is very simple. I'm going to tell you, you already know if you're here, what's going to happen to you. And I want to take away from you one precious commodity, which is that you'll never be able to say, we didn't know. Because your generation has to face the problems of your time, which is multiculturalism, making this one nation woven together, which my generation has not been able to do, the environment, and secondly, fiscal responsibility. Those are your challenges, very much like the Peace Corps and civil rights of Vietnam were the challenges of my time. And it's really going to be up to you to aggressively deal with these things with the same single-mindedness and willingness to confront that we did on these other issues. You're going to have to be tough, obnoxious, arrogant, all the things that come naturally to Harvard. I say that as these gentlemen here, as you know, went to Harvard, graduated. I did not go to Harvard. I went to a lesser school in New Haven. But I came to the Kennedy School, and am a Kennedy School dropout. So that gives me a certain disadvantage in this situation. Given the time frame, I wanted to set that tone. The specifics are in here. And this is the Concord Coalition's zero deficit budget, drops the deficit to zero by the year 2000. The major part of it is entitlements. It's to means test entitlements so that your generation has a shot. Now, you may blow it, but you should have a right to have an opportunity to access the American dream the way we did. We have a few copies here that I and John signed. John, as you know, is also one of the co-founders of the Concord Coalition, and we have hundreds of these things. And to the extent that you would like a copy, we'd be glad to make it available to you. How long was that?
4 minutes.
Best I ever did when I was in the office.
Thank you, Paul. Very well done. Thank you. And now we'll hear from the State Treasurer. Mr. Malone?
Thank you very much, John. It is a delight to be here with the Senator and the Congressman. I have only been in office for 2.5 years, so I've watched from a distance as these two gentlemen have spoken with frankness about the problems that exist in our government and where this country is heading. From my standpoint, I heard from some other people how in Massachusetts every ounce of fat had been cut out of state government, and that if you were to cut one more ounce, you were going to hit raw nerve. And when I was elected in November of 1990, one of the first things I did was to call on the big 6 accounting firms, and I asked if they would be kind enough to, on a voluntary basis, send some of their best and brightest people into the Treasurer's office and do for the State Treasury what they do for Fortune 500 companies. That is, look at the operation and then tell us how we could be more efficient and more effective. Well, after 8 weeks of 42 people interviewing all of the employees, talking to employees from treasurer's offices around the country, comparing private sector approaches to public sector approaches, we were able to take an office that used to employ 325 employees, and today we run it with 148 employees. In fact, that operation had mushroomed so much that they even had to go out and rent private sector buildings in order to house all of the employees. And it was more than my predecessor who had built this operation up to its size, because clearly with each budget that came around, there were a group of analysts who would come in and determine whether or not that number of employees was necessary to run the state treasury. And I can only assume that that's what happens in the system when the citizens aren't vigilant enough to say, we demand top value for our dollar. Because we also went down to another operation that we run, and that is the state lottery. It used to have 525 employees. Today, it has 410. And so in looking at just my small experience and seeing that we're spending 30% less in the Treasury than was being spent in 1989, I don't buy this argument that more can't be done in terms of bringing about greater efficiency and more value for people's dollars from our federal government down in Washington. And when the President stepped into office last January, I was saddened to see that right away he seemed to give up the fight on the line item veto, because I think in order to make sure that that pork barrel machine doesn't continue doing what it's done in the past, an executive has to step up and say, this is good, but that isn't, and I owe the people of America the kind of performance from government and the kind of spending priorities that they elected me to oversee when they put me into this office. And there are so many other places where we can start, and I know that there are entitlements that have to be addressed and that those are the bigger fish, but step one is saying to the American people, we've heard your message and we're going to give you the efficient government you want. Down in the city of Baltimore, they've instituted now a program where instead of having the public sector education people running the physical plant of their education system, they've brought in a private management company, and they're now maintaining those schools for 40% less than that they were paying in the past. Well, when you're able to do that, you then hold it up as an example to those taxpayers and say, have some faith in government, we've heard your message, and we're moving in the right direction. I believe that the reason why our economy today is so stagnant is that the great middle class of this country, at the end of every month, is sending in checks to pay their bills, and they're saying, we don't have any more money. We don't have the money to buy the new car. We don't have the money to go out to eat as often as we used to. We don't have the money to rotate the tires as often as we used to in the past. We're simply going to stay in our bunkers as consumers because government at all levels has continued to reach into our pockets to the point where we're no longer able to do what our parents did, which is put aside a little bit every month so that our children can be educated, and so we'll have a nest egg for our future years. And that's what needs to change, because as long as we continue to discourage the middle class of this country, and for that matter, all people in this country, then we're going in the opposite direction of what built America. Optimism, in my opinion, is what made this country great, and as soon as government gets around to giving the people their money's worth when they spend it down in Washington and Boston and other units of government throughout this country, then and only then will you see that optimism return. Thank you very much. Again, I look forward to answering your questions.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. I think we need to talk some more about that as well. There's no question that there's an importance of efficiency in government, but I think there's also no question that that alone won't get us where we need to go, as you indicated. It's a starting point. Now let me turn to Congressman Frank.
I think it's essential that we find some large areas of cuts we can make. There's going to be some pain in all the cuts, but there's one area where we haven't cut enough, and that has to do with national security. For 50 years, we have been, clapping takes time, so I don't mean to be rude, but for 50 years, we have made national defense the single greatest priority of the federal government, in the sense that it not only cost a lot of money, but when we argued about it, we said, gee, we better err on the side of spending because we don't want to take any risk. There has been a qualitative change in what we face in the world. There is no longer, and this is for the first time since the rise of Hitler, there is no longer in the world today any foreign power or combination of powers that threatens the security of the United States. There are some very obnoxious people out there. There are people running countries who shouldn't even be allowed to drive cars. They are a problem for us. But they are not a threat to national security, and that's a qualitative difference, and we have not adjusted to it. Bill Clinton has moved in that direction, but not nearly far enough. By a 5-year period, we should be spending about 60% of what we're now spending on national security. One area is the CIA. The CIA, and I lost, I had an amendment, and the president, I thought, although I generally agree with him, was on the wrong side of this. The CIA budget hasn't been cut a penny from last year to this year. We are spending as much money on not just the CIA, but intelligence in general. And I'm not allowed by law to tell you how much that is, by the way. I try to change that. But there's a law that says you can't say the total. The New York Times says it's $28 billion. I can't tell you what I think. But the fact is that we're still spending that. What we're getting from the CIA and others is a great deal of insistence on continuing to spend when the need has substantially diminished. That doesn't mean that there aren't security problems in the world. We continue, for instance, as we sit here today, to subsidize Western Europe. We are spending billions and billions of dollars of troops in Western Europe, protecting them from God knows what. Now, and people said, well, you know, things can come back. I believe it is possible for bad people to come back into power in Russia. I wish that wasn't the case. But the likelihood of them assembling the kind of power that once again threatens our security is relatively nil. It is certainly the case that Eastern Europe is not going to go back online with them. What that means is that we can be by far the strongest nation in the world militarily, well able to deal with any conceivable threat to our national security for about 60% of what we're now spending and have a considerable margin of error. Now, there are other cuts to make, and I think the Concord Coalition has done a very important job in talking about starting to means test some of the entitlements. By the way, we took a first step on that this year, and unfortunately it became a partisan issue, because in the budget that passed, we did increase the taxes on people who are on Social Security who make more than $40,000 a year. And that was one of the things that the Republicans attacked in that budget. I think they were dead wrong in that. I think increasing the taxation on the people who make more than $40,000 a year, taxing part of that Social Security was a very reasonable first step. I think there's more to be done in recapturing the Medicare subsidy for people who are wealthy and still get it. But we're not going to get there until we find there being a substantially reduced deficit to where zero is a reasonable chance. We're not going to get there until we make some major cuts in some major areas of expenditure. And we continue to overspend on the military. It's become especially clear that the United States, the population, isn't supportive of an active military all over the world. So we are now at the point where we are going to be paying a great deal of money for people who we will insist do very little. Yes, we want to be secure. Yes, we want to be able to go to the aid of others. Yes, we want to participate in sensible peacekeeping. We can do that for about 60% of where we are. Last point, people who tell me that we can, I'm talking about spending on the military about half of what we were spending 5 years ago, the military and intelligence. If you believe that we can't cut it by half, then you must believe that the Soviet Union and its allies were less than half of the problem we were facing years ago. Yeah, Iraq is a problem. Iran is a problem. There are problems out there. None of them qualitatively remotely approach what we faced before. And the fact is that we can bring it down. We have to do it gradually so we don't cause economic shocks as we bring things down, although a sensible conversion policy can help mitigate that. But if we don't do that, if we aren't prepared to say that we'll make that change, then I really am in despair. There is no other area in the federal government where the purpose for which we were spending has been so nearly accomplished. We have defeated that major threat, the Soviet Union. If we don't now make a very substantial reduction in national security expenditures, then I don't think we get to the point that we want to get to.
Thank you very much. I used to review the intelligence budget when I was in the Office of Management and Budget, and I can't tell you how big it is either. I want to turn it over to our panelists for a few minutes of discussion, and I want to start with a couple of broad questions and let them just go at it. One is it really possible to cut this budget and to solve these problems without being unfair to either end of the generation spectrum? The second one is, what does the new health care proposal do to this? Because obviously it is related directly to the problem of the size of the budget, other than the interest on the debt, health care in the budget being the fastest growing element and the largest problem for the deficit. And finally, what can these people in this room, particularly the younger generations, do so that, in fact, as Senator Songus said, they won't just be able to say, oh my God, they told me so, but I didn't do anything about it, but will, in fact, go forward with some solutions rather than the problems that we're so busy leaving to them. So let me turn it over to the panel. Paul, would you like to start? And I'll just ask the others to get involved.
Well, as far as the issue of fairness is concerned, let me, those of you who are taking notes, I don't know why you're doing it, but those of you with photographic memories, it would be equally applicable here. Federal budget in 1992, so it's worse now. 50% entitlements. So 50% of all our spending is the government sending somebody a check. 18% defense dropping. 17% interest on the debt growing. And everything else is 15%. So all of government, as we noted, including the CIA, whatever that number happens to be, is 15%. The 15% is less than the deficit. So someone who says to you that we can balance this budget by spending cuts is lying. It's not that they don't know that they're misinformed, they're lying to you. So it's just, these are all Warren Rudman's numbers, so I should acknowledge, I've listened to him so often they're drummed into my head. 1970, 15 workers for every person receiving entitlements. Today it's 3 to 1. And it's soon going to be 2 to 1. So where you end up politically is not Democrats, Republicans, liberal conservatives, it's the party of the workers versus the party of the retirees. And there's a pathology to that kind of politics. That's what's coming, whether we ever met today or not, not going to change that reality. So in terms of fairness, the fact is that to ask someone who's getting a entitlement check when they make $80,000 a year, and that check, since we're in deficit, comes from people who are young and make a lot less, is not fair. And the wealthy got hit in the tax bill, which I applauded and supported. But the fact is, fairness today is measured in young people, particularly poor young people, who have no access to the country as we know it. So, by the way, to be hopeful, senior citizens divide into two groups. One group is I paid my money and I want it back, and you keep your goddamn hands off of it. You recognize that group. The second group are those who come up to you after our speeches and say, I'm terrified about my grandkids. And to encourage you, the latter group is growing. And the first group, Warren is wonderful. He'll say, the person will get up and go through the usual greed motif, and Warren will say, when did you retire? And the poor person unknowingly will give the answer. And then Warren will go through, well, you got your money back 6 years ago, and you got it back with interest, and in 3 years you'll get back that plus interest plus every penny you ever paid. If you retired in 1980, you've gotten back every penny in Social Security, Medicare, and federal taxes with interest. On health care, you have to have health care reform. I think the president's speech was superb. The fact is that it's overly loaded with new entitlements. It has a lot of government regulation, and I think the Congress will strip some of these entitlements away. I mean, for example, home care, long-term care, what does it cost? Nobody has any idea. And to begin to venture down that road until you know what you're dealing with is a mistake. So do the core package and then go on to the other entitlements later. What you can do, what every generation's had to do, you know how the war in Vietnam was stopped? Very aggressive behavior by people your age. Not by reason, not by intellect. My wife and I would go down to Washington and demonstrate against Nixon and all of those kinds of things. And the fact is, your generation is going to have to go from kind of classroom academic discussions to some action that is far more aggressive. And as I understand it, some of that will be taking place next spring, and I applaud it.
Thank you.
See, I think it's less of a battle between young and old and more of a battle between those in government versus those who are out there producing the revenues that government ends up consuming. I see it up in the State House where the public service unions have lobbyists up there every hour of every day, it seems, to make sure that, for example, privatization is made difficult to accomplish, even though it's been proven that it can save the taxpayer money. Down in Washington, we hear all these nightmarish stories about the agricultural department and what a wasteful bureaucracy it is, but yet we're saying to that person out there, send more money down to Washington, and then we'll get around to cutting, maybe next year, maybe the year after. What happened to Graham-Rudman? Wasn't that supposed to put caps on spending? Those caps were blown through the roof. I think it's time that more people down in Washington are courageous enough to say no to someone who shows up with a computer list with a lot of names on it and threatens to work against them in the next election cycle. And if that doesn't succeed, then the next step is to put term limits in. And I know that a lot of people say, oh, you'll throw the whole system down in Washington in an uproar. Well, maybe that's the way to go, because the system isn't working right now. The system is what has brought us this disgraceful deficit and this disgraceful national debt. I think before we look at the people out there, we look at Washington and the leadership down in Washington, and no disrespect meant to you, Congressman, and you're no longer there, Senator, but I think there is a system in place. But there's a system, and there's a system. I wish you were there, actually. there's a system in place there that has to be changed radically, and I think that's what the people were hoping for when they elected Bill Clinton. You know, I don't suggest that George Bush was looking at the world in the right manner, and when he was telling people that there was no recession, and when the people who went down there saying they were going to clean up the cesspool then suddenly thought it was a jacuzzi and they jumped in, that wasn't right either. But now the time has come, with that middle class being so squeezed the way they are, to change the system in a manner that's going to bring about better results.
Joe, I guess I want to express some difference. I think courage is a great thing, but courage in general does not impress me. I think courage has to get specific, and I think the only way we're going to make cuts is specific. Yes, I want to make things more efficient. Some of the inefficiency is politically supported. Some of the inefficiency is inherent in human activity. People aren't always efficient. And I think you have to talk about things. The question, for instance, said, do we do something about older people in part? I don't think you can just not answer that part of it. In fact, we did start that this year. And I'm encouraged because the group that Paul talks about, the first group, is larger than we thought. We raised taxes on people who are on Social Security. We went from 50% to 85%. 85% was chosen because that's, for the average person, you paid in about 15% of what you're getting back. If you're the average person, you live the average lifetime as an older person, you will have paid in 15% of what you get back. So we raised the taxes to 85% on people who made more than $40,000. Now, originally, by the way, it was going to be $25,000, and I voted for that in the House. And we got political pressure in the Senate, and so they backed off a little bit. But I have to say that became a partisan issue. The Republican Party attacked us for it, and in fact offered some amendments to knock that one out specifically. Now, I also agree we should go ahead and do the same thing with Medicare. I would make it a somewhat higher amount for Medicare, but I am in favor of some means testing over there. On the other hand, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that one of the best things we ever did, in my judgment, was to index the cost of living for Social Security. Now, too many people get it at the upper end, and we dealt with that in part by the taxation. But we have substantially reduced the extent to which, when you got old, you went into poverty. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. It used to be that when you got older, if you didn't have rich children, you could expect to have a very substantial drop in your living standard. We've avoided that. The approach that the Concord Coalition is talking about, the approach that we began to implement this year in the budget, is to differentiate. A large number of old people are going to need help, and that's going to be there for other people who get old. I mean, everybody I know plans to be old someday. And we want to have that in place. But I do think it makes sense to means test it, and I think that's the way to go. I do also want to say I have a problem, because Joe raised the line item veto, and Paul raised Vietnam, they're linked. Given the way the courts have interpreted the Constitution of the United States, the only way in American history any president has ever been restrained from sending troops into battle when he didn't have strong support in the country was by an amendment to an appropriations bill. There is no other constitutionally enforceable way, given the way the courts have acted, to restrain the president. So whether it was Somalia or Angola or Nicaragua or Vietnam, the only way you can do it is by that. Therefore, I am not for a line item veto. I do like the enhanced rescission, where the president can require a separate vote on each point. He can say, that's a little extra, and I want you to re-vote on that one. But I want that vote to be by a majority or not two-thirds, because if you have the line item veto in its any form I can think of, it means that you could not restrain the president from sending troops into battle unless you got two-thirds of both houses, which would be virtually impossible.
Thank you very much.
John,
Yes, go ahead.
let me, this is a bit unfair since two Democrats and one Republican, but well, let me tell you what's happening on this issue. And the fact is that Joe represents a part of the Republican Party that was almost extinct, and hopefully is coming back. What happened is this. Bill Clinton got elected and began to move on issues like the deficit, not the way we would like to see, but at least you had discussion the way that Bush could not do it. And issues like Social Security that Barney made reference to. People in the Senate who are Republicans who were more courageous than the Democrats for years on these issues turned around and attacked them. Because when they marched up the hill when Reagan was president and he cut their legs out, Republicans learned their lesson because a lot of them got wiped out next time around. So what you have now is an interesting situation when you have a Democrat that's not as aggressive as I like to see, and I think the Concord Coalition. But on the other side, you have Republicans who are seeking partisan advantage in giving up the moral high ground that they once inhabited. Give you one example. I know this is going to sound ridiculous, that it's inconceivable, but let me just throw it out for the sake of discussion. Let's say you had somebody who wanted to be president of the United States. And,
Anybody?
Again, this is stretching the point, but and had, for example, as a platform, let's say a senator, to use a, for instance, the following 7 points. 1, for a balanced budget amendment, feels very strongly about fiscal discipline and those kinds of things. Secondly, no new taxes. Remember the numbers I gave you earlier? Okay. Thirdly, no touching of Social Security. 4, for the superconducting super collider. 5, for the space station. 6, for mohair subsidies. And 7, for wool subsidies. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous and nobody would ever do that. But when Phil Graham comes here, raise it with him. You know? Because to be for these things is to insult your intelligence and to think you're really pretty stupid, actually. That no one's going to sit down and add it up and say, gee, that doesn't work. And so what you have is an opportunity, because now that 1996 looks closer than it did before, and you get all these Republicans running, it is your job to bushwhack these people. And they'll all come by, they will all be in this room at one time or another. And your job is to know these issues backwards and forwards. And when they come to, talk the talk and walk the walk, that your job is to let them have it. So they figure out, I'm going to have to be responsible. That there is more political minus in engaging in rhetoric and baloney than there is telling the truth. And for all his problems, Ross Perot did more in 1992 to educate the American people on this stuff than anybody else. And your job is to take, in essence, that kind of a beginning and force the Republicans to put a candidate out, and there are some good people out there, who offer an alternative that gives the American people in 1996 a responsible choice, and not what is happening now, unfortunately, where the Republicans, at least at the national level, not so, in Massachusetts it's a different story, but at the national level, the Republicans have wandered away from what I used to respect as the moral high ground on these issues, and are engaging in, I think, very unfortunate partisanship.
I think in that vast world outside of Washington, people are starting to look at politics less from a Republican-Democratic standpoint and more from the standpoint of who is going to get into government for the purpose of solving problems. And again, all I seem to hear as a citizen way out here in Massachusetts is that spending can't be brought under control at the federal level. We now have more government workers in this country than we have manufacturing workers. And I think we've gotten to the point where this whole snowball effect of government needs to be reined in. Otherwise, we are going to end up seeing a tyrannical government that just keeps taking more and more of our money, and instead of working up until May 4th to pay for government, you'll find you'll be working into June to pay for government. The time has come to go back to what made this country great, which is to give people their individual freedom to go out and work and achieve their dreams. And those programs that government must run them in a way that they work. The welfare dollar now, for every dollar that goes down to Washington, more than 60 cents of that dollar is eaten up by the bureaucracy, while some 40 cents ends up in the hands of the
No, Joe, that's not true. Welfare, AFDC? That simply isn't true. There's no federal bureaucracy with AFDC.
When you combine all
Joe,
the
that simply isn't
welfare
true about
I
AFDC.
disagree.
What do you mean by welfare?
Check with the Neighborhood Foundation down in Washington.
Joe, don't
the poverty dollars.
Don't you know the numbers yourself? You just gotta say,
Yeah.
what do you mean by welfare? If you mean AFDC, that's simply wrong.
When you're
There
talking
is-
about all poverty dollars. When you're talking about all of
Is
the
that
kind of-
AFDC? What are they? Which ones?
That's AFDC, that's food stamps, that's whatever other programs that launched by Washington.
I'm very unimpressed by whatever other programs. As a matter of fact, AFDC, there's virtually no federal bureaucracy. That's administered at the state level. And when you say welfare, that's what people think about. And food
Any
stamps,
of the
there's...
grant programs that go
Joe,
to
you
the
can't
inner
talk
city.
like this. Any of the grant programs, they have very different ratios.
Well, then I
Are you
guess the
talking about...
welfare program is working just fine. The status quo works just
Joe,
fine.
why the caricature? No one said the status quo
Well,
works
that's
just
what
fine.
I'm saying. There is the
No,
need to
what you're
reform
saying
these
is-
programs that aren't working.
What you're saying is, I want to be for cuts, but I don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to get specific. I
That's
don't want to
not
make
true.
anyone
I can
angry.
support
You can't even
means
tell me what
testing
programs
for
we're
Social
talking
Security.
about.
I'm talking about the disgrace
Well, would
that
you
the
have voted-
welfare system has become in this country.
No, you weren't talking about that. You were talking about dollars that stayed in Washington. Now, the problems with AFDC, they're very serious problems. But with AFDC, it is not that dollars stay in Washington, because the AFDC program, there's virtually no federal administration. Food stamps, there's more of one, and there is a problem with food stamps, although much of the money that goes down there is to try and catch fraud. What I'm saying is, you're talking in very broad generalizations. When you say 60 cents out of every dollar of every welfare program goes in, you can't even tell me what programs you're talking about. I'm not impressed.
Well, I'm talking about a foundation that monitors these kind of issues. That
What
ends up
issues?
sa-
Which programs? They're very
Anything-
different.
Anything from food stamps to the grant programs for inner cities that ends up with a
Well, why?
tax
And by
dollar
the way,
going from
why
the
just inner
tax-
cities? Why do you only talk about the problems with inefficiency with the inner cities? Because we have problems that help the middle class too.
Sure, you have an education system that's getting worse rather than better. And what has been the answer to that? Nothing. To stand by while the system grows worse and worse.
But that's
Public
not
ed-
relevant to what we're talking. Public
Sure it is.
education.
Well,
There are
you're
no
saying,
federal
why
dollars
single
there.
out the welfare system in the cities? I'll single out another program.
No, I'm asking you why you
Education is a
single
failure.
out. Why? First place, you lump together a lot of programs that are very different. That you can't. AFDC is an entitlement program where money goes right back. There are grant programs where there's some discretion. Urban programs, some of them, they go right back to the states through the Community Development Block Grant. You really can't. What I'm objecting to is a generalization that avoids any specifics, gives people no guidance, and by talking only about waste, avoids even suggesting that you're going to make any hard choice, because some of these choices you're going to have to cut real things, not just waste, to
First
get
of
anywhere.
all, I'm saying if we're not willing to take the first step of cutting out these boondoggles that people are frankly fed up about, but secondly, if we're not willing to look at the public education system and say we're getting kids dropping out of school who then end up in prison, who then end up with all sorts of other problems, then we're not getting to the
Oh,
core
I agree,
of
but you
what's
just changed
driving-
you just changed the subject and
No,
got
well,
off the
I'll
need
stay
to
with
try and talk
welfare.
about the programs.
I'll stay with the welfare system. The welfare system in this country isn't working. And the
I
reason
agree.
why it isn't working is because the federal government is a monopoly that is going
No,
to try to solve the
Joe,
problem.
you're dead
so that it
wrong
doesn't
about
work.
welfare. Let me just finish my sentence. You can say whatever you want after this, but when you say that the reason the welfare system isn't working is that the federal government is a monopoly, you're dead wrong. The fact is that AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, the fundamental welfare program, is administered at the state level. There are broad federal guidelines, but it's administered at the state level. There's virtually no federal bureaucracy, and the problem with AFDC can hardly be a federal monopoly because it's largely run by the states.
Well, let me compare it to if you have entities in the inner city, not-for-profits, who are performing better than the federal government is performing. The federal government doesn't give them more money to deal with their problems. Instead, the federal government is saying, we're going to keep our bureaucracy in check, even though it doesn't work. And again, whether it's this problem or whether it's the educational system in this country, people
That's
are
irrelevant to
protecting the
AFDC, Joe.
status
You got the
quo.
wrong program. You
Well,
may be
you're
talking about
the one
housing
who's
program.
decided to single out just AFDC.
Well, I'll talk
Congressman.
about any specific one you want, but I think we ought to get the specifics.
Well, I want to talk about the welfare program in general. If you want to be a defender of the welfare program in this country that has destroyed
Joe,
the
that's
city-
silly. I'm not defending it. I'm talking,
Well,
but
then
I
don't
think you
bring
have to
around
talk
AFDC.
specifically.
Let
You have to
turn
talk
it over.
specifically about how to
Is there a
improve it.
moderator in the house?
Yes,
I
let me.
will only say,
Let me turn it over. Let me turn it over to some specifics from the audience, if you would ask your questions. This young lady here, yes.
My friend and I have this area of concern. Why should we bother saving money for our retirement when it would cause or might cause means testing? If I save a lot of money now, am I going to be denied all benefits in the future because I'll have provided for myself?
Well, you think you will have provided for yourself. And let me say that under the means testing, if you have an income that is 40,000 or below, you get it all. And if you go from 40 to 50, you lose 10% of your check. So, for example, if you get $10,000 in checks from Uncle Sam, you'll get $9,000. So your income will be $49,000, not $50,000. If you go up to Ross Perot's income level, you'll get 15%. So everybody will get something. But the presumption that you make that I'll be okay, well, a lot of us have gone through tragedies in our life, things we didn't quite expect. And the fact is that you have no idea how you'll do. I mean, you may walk out of here and get hit by a car or something, and the next thing you know, we're all going to have to help take care of you. So I think the point is that this idea, for example, of voluntary Social Security is great in theory, but the fact is some people won't put their money in. And what we have to do is make sure that if you put your money in and you do very well in your life, that you'll get something back because it is in fact an entitlement. But you won't get back more than you should from a government that's in debt. If I could just interject one question to Joe, if I can. I think you're absolutely right. The major feeling at the state level is not efficiency, because you've done a good job. I mean, it wasn't the hardest act to follow, you'd have to agree.
Agreed, but again, it was all those other legislators voting for his budget.
I agree, and I think I'm very complimentary in my public statements about how you've done. But the major feeling of this Republican administration at the state level is the total disregard of public education, K through 12 and higher education. The fact is that, you know, we're all products of very good private schools. My daughter is at a private school. My youngest is in the public schools. Now, if you don't do something about K through 12 with a massive class size and the raising tuitions on public higher education, you have no future. Now, the answer to that is very simple, been done in other states. 1 cent increase in the sales tax with 2/3, 3/4 of money going to K through 12 and the other going to public higher education. It's at 5 cents now, going to 6, not a big deal, but you would ensure the future of all these kids out there who can't even consider going to Harvard, who are in massive classes, and their future is being taken from them. So you approach the governor and you say, Governor Weld, I'm with you on choice, I'm with you on gay rights, I'm with you on privatization, those kinds of things, but you have to get a handle on education. What's the answer? The answer is, I promise I wouldn't raise taxes. That is the introduction of ideology and personal political self-interest over the good of not only the children, but the state as a whole. And the fact is that your party is going to have to figure out there are some things worth paying for. And education and AFDC and those kinds of things are, in fact, not only good on a humanitarian basis, but simply good economic policy long term.
But I think your party... But I think your party has to say to the teachers' lobby, enough of worrying about teachers first, and it's time to make sure that the students come first. Even the idea of choosing a school. If I'm someone poor living in the city of Boston, I think it's kind of sad that I'm told, send your children to either that school or no other school. That's the only education they're going to get. You don't have the kind of luxury of sending your child to a private school and paying that kind of money if you're a poor person living in that city. When our GIs...
I happen to agree with you.
Let's get some other questions in. Yes, sir.
Congressman.
Go ahead.
The first thing I want to say is I can't get this close to talking to Senator Songus without thanking you for being the voice in this country that you've been over the last couple of years. Secondly, Congressman Frank, you spoke about the need for specifics, but beyond the 60% cuts in defense that you spoke about, could you give some specifics?
Sure. The space station, the supercollider which we've killed, most of the agricultural subsidies, much of what the Concord Coalition talked about, the taxation we put on people making more than $40,000 in Social Security, and I voted for it at a lower level. I would means test Medicare. The proposal George Bush made I was for, which started at $125,000. Unfortunately, people backed off on that one. The agriculture, we did get rid of the super collider, and that one, frankly, I would have if we could have gotten rid of the space station, I think I would have voted to retain the super collider, because that seemed to me, unlike the space station, to have some scientific worth. But the manned space station is purely gimmicky. The advanced science rocket motor. Then, after you get through with those, you put some caps on virtually everything. They were across the board limits. But those are the, and I also voted to end the National Endowment for Democracy. I think it's a worthwhile organization, but not essential. And those are some of the cuts that I voted for.
Does that get us there?
Beg pardon?
Does that get us there?
With the military cuts we're talking about, and then other things, I think the limitation on the mortgage interest deduction, I'm not sure about the specifics in the Concord proposal, but I have voted for limitations, and I think It's $750,000 a year now, which is way too high. I think we could bring that down substantially. Yeah, with the cuts. Now, I would put more of the spending cuts I would put in national security and less in some other areas. Other things the Concord Coalition talks about, the specific projects that members of Congress add on, I think they are absolutely right. We should end those. They're coming down. We're making some progress on those, but I would do those more rapidly. But yeah, with the kind of military cuts we're talking about, if you start now and you phase those in by the end of the century, absolutely.
Thank you. This young man.
My name is Keith Hennessy. I'm a second-year student here. I worked this summer at OMB as an analyst. And pardon me if I seem a bit abrupt. I'm wondering if Mr. Malone or Congressman Frank, if you were listening to Mr. Songus. I understand that the two of you have different views as to how you should cut discretionary spending. Congressman Frank, you want to take most of it out of national security. Mr. Malone, domestic discretionary. But national security is at the lowest point in terms of percent of GDP since World War II. Domestic discretionary, you can cut it all, and we're still not going to balance the budget. Okay? I will agree to and support the two of you on whatever plan you come up with for reducing those two portions of the pie, provided that you endorse something like the Concord's Coalition means test of entitlements. Willie Sutton said he robs banks because that's where the money is. If you want to go and balance the budget, you have to go where the money is, and that is entitlements for the elderly. Congressman Frank, would you support the Concord Coalition's means test of entitlements as it's written in the plan? Mr. Malone, same question if you were in his position.
And the answer is yes, I would.
And my answer is no, because I think 40,000 is too low. I haven't seen exactly the Medicare impact, but I also want to respond. I think, first of all, the statistic you cite that national security is now at the lowest point since World War II of the gross product. Of course it is, but it ought to be even lower. Frankly, I think that's kind of mindless. The question is not whether it's lower than it used to be, but whether it's where it should be. World War II is an appropriate point. It's much, much higher than it was in the 30s, much, much higher than it was in the 20s. In fact, Adolf Hitler sent the national security budget way up, as was appropriate, and Stalin and everybody else kept it there. So the fact that you are talking about a comparison to a period when, for 50 years, there were absolute threats to our national security and to the values we care about, I think that's an irrelevant comparison. And yeah, I would cut another $100 billion a year out of national security. So I disagree with your suggestion that that's trivial, because that's in effect what you were saying, that that's not where the money is. No, I think the money is very much there. I think a CIA budget, an intelligence budget that's almost $30 billion today, and the troops we've got in Europe and the troops we've got in Japan is a great waste. I also said I volunteered that I voted a means test Social Security. I voted a means test Medicare, and I voted for the taxation of Social Security. The 40,000 level on what it does with Medicare, I haven't read the whole program yet. So I'm for some limitation. 40,000 may be too low for me for some aspects of what they're talking about. But I do want to go back. I think you are being much too dismissive. And OMB where you worked, and I realize you weren't making the calls, but OMB where you worked has been much too respectful of national security. Yes, it's lower than it was, but World War II and the height of the Cold War are irrelevant comparisons. We ought to look at what we need, and we need half or less of what we needed then, and that's well over $100 billion a year I'm talking about, nothing trivial.
If I, let me suggest something. The issue is not so much to me how you get there. You can argue the details, but that you get there, which I think is the point that you were making. So one thing that the Kennedy School might do is to send a letter to all the aspiring presidential candidates and say, we invite you to come here on your way to New Hampshire and bring with you your plan to reduce the deficit to zero by the year you pick it. 2,000 is enough of a cushion to get you there, and see what they come up with. So that they're not in a position of giving you words without the specifics. I would also tell you that Alice Rivlin called the Concord Coalition, I think John knows this, or one of her people did, and asked for 30 copies of the budget. And Alice Rivlin called a late night session of some of the key people at OMB to go through this in detail. So I don't think the problem, frankly, is OMB. I think the Leon Panetta, Alice Rivlin, you talk about some very, very good people, It really is a matter of political will in another building, or another couple of buildings in Washington.
Thank
Over
you,
here.
Senator.
I have a question for former Senator Songus. So that there's no ambiguity, could you list for us the fastest growing specific programs, federal spending programs in Washington, the ones that are behind the youth tax?
The ones that are behind the...
The deficit, the youth tax.
Not bad. There's hope. The fact is that health care is the fastest growing. Defense is coming down. We can argue about how much, but it is in fact coming down. One thing, by the way, on that, because it is health that is driving all of this, the discussion on health care did not come out of some new notion about concern about the uninsured. Harry Truman raised this. So the reason we're talking about this with such fervor is the impact of the deficit. Now, the Concord Coalition's budget presumes not a penny of savings from health care before the year 2000. Now, the presumption of the administration of savings from health care went from 91 billion to 58 billion in what, 2 weeks? Where'd it go? Now, that makes me nervous. That makes me very nervous. And so what we presume is not a penny of savings before the year 2000. We're going to balance the budget on all the other stuff. And if we can bring about real reform of the healthcare system, then we pick up the savings after the year 2000. I'll tell you something. You make a mistake on healthcare, given the enormity of those numbers, the ball game, she is over. And that's why Congress really has to get into this thing and do a bare bones core package, bring everybody in, everybody has the right to it. And then if you can contain the costs, then add these other things over time. But you make a mistake on this stuff, a 5% differential in estimate is enormous. And so, but I have great confidence, frankly, that this is one issue where I think the Congress is scared stiff over the budget numbers and will actually do something to get a handle on that, the fastest growing component of the budget deficit.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, real brief comment before my question. I want to applaud Joe Malone and what you're saying here today, because I think there's a second deficit out there that's very important, and that's the trust deficit. And while, Senator Songus, you're correct, you can't do it in spending cuts alone, I think if government, before they ask for another dollar from me or anyone else, should re-earn that trust that they can spend it well. The question, Congressman Frank, you're talking about very significant cuts in defense. Two-part, do you have a base in your district, and if not, are you ready to go to Jerry Studs and George Mitchell and tell them South Weymouth is not a huge priority in national security, the P3 base in Brunswick is not? How politically are you going to do that?
Well, in fact, you're the second person to ask me that. John Tower was the first. John Tower a few years ago said, oh, all you people want to make cuts in defense. Why don't you suggest a cut in your own state's defense? And we were at the time in Massachusetts the third largest recipient in the country of research funds for the MX. And I think, Paul, you were still there, and all of us signed it, every single one of us, including Sil Conti. All of us from Massachusetts sent John Tower a letter and said, we're third in the MX, why don't you get rid of the foolish thing? And John never answered my letter. So the premise of your suggestion that I'm not willing to make cuts in my own area is simply wrong.
I said your own district, Congressman.
Yeah, well,
there's cover in numbers.
Yeah, there's cover in numbers. The fact is that my district participated in the MX research like everybody else did. It was not a case that at the time my district was the only one in Massachusetts that didn't have MX research. Yes, I have been willing. I voted, and the other answer is I voted against the Democratic leadership's position for the base closing bill, which said that Congress would not vote base by base. And I have voted for every base closing bill, although it's included some things in Massachusetts. So I voted for the base closing bill, which said Congress wouldn't be able to amend the procedure and wouldn't be able to vote to save specific bases, but would in fact give that to a bipartisan commission. And I have voted for it and voted against any effort to change it. And so, yeah, I'd be perfectly willing to tell people in New England that we have bases that should be closed, because as the military shrinks in its mission, it ought to shrink in funding. And that's the key point. When we talk about it, there was no other area in the federal government where the mission, no other substantial area. I mean, we got rid of the honeybee program and the mohair program. We should have done those years ago. We just get rid of them now. But there is no significant area of spending where the mission has diminished as substantially as defense, and we haven't caught up with it. But to answer your question, yeah, I voted consistently for cuts in domestic bases. I voted for the Base Closing Commission, and I have voted against, well, just the closest one I've got now, I'll just answer you, is the nuclear submarines, because people in Fall River and elsewhere work there, and I've had a lot of letters about them, and I voted to cut them and think we don't need them, and I have written to people in my district and said, I'm sorry, I can't go on that basis. It's similar with the Super Collider, by the way, where people, a company in Newton wrote to me and said, we have several hundred people working on the Super Collider, and I said, it's not a worthless project, it's got a lot of worth, but we have a deficit, and I'm voting to kill it.
Over here.
Let me, as I commended Joe on the job he's done, the fact is that Bonnie Frank is one of the few people where there's no gap between the rhetoric and the voting record, and I just wanted to make that clear.
Yes, I'd like to address my question to Senator Songus. I agree with basically everything you said, but one point I think that should be added, and I wonder how you would address it, is not only what could happen in 10 years, but what could literally happen tomorrow, given the minefield of an economy we have. If for some reason interest rates should go up, if Japan, for whatever reason, decide not to buy treasury bills, they had an earthquake or whatever, we have, for the first time in our histories, we have deposits in stock mutual funds and money market funds approaching the amount of savings accounts. This is a minefield, and some anecdotal situation will tick it off, but what happens tomorrow if that happens, and how would you suggest government address that?
Well, my advice, if it happens tomorrow, emigrate. If you read Figge's book, Bankruptcy 1995, which I commend to you not because I think it's going to happen, certainly not in that time frame necessarily, but it gives you a real-world example of what happens when it gets away from you. You get all these people in Washington think they're in control. Well, they're in control as long as the market behaves rationally. But there are a number of scenarios, and you raise them. Wait, what's going on today? Everybody's taking their money out of CDs, put it into mutual funds because there ain't no return on CDs. Well, what happens when interest rates spike up again, which they will eventually? It goes the other way. All the capital flows out, all the problems inherent with that. That's why the deficit is so dangerous, because you don't know what's going to happen. And you're on this thin ice figuring, well, gee, I took that other step and it hasn't cracked yet. I'll take another step, keep on going. Once it cracks, then everybody is a genius. What Washington and the American public, the press, are very good at is retrospect. When something, look, take an intersection in your hometown that has a stop sign. Right? When did they put in the stop sign? After the accident, right? Why didn't they put the stop sign in before? Because there was no accident. Well, once you have the fiscal crisis, everybody is going to be a Concord Coalition card-carrying member who's for eliminating the deficit. And the great fear that you raised, I must say the two things I worry about the most. One is a nuclear weapon smuggled in and detonated in New York City. When I was running, that was the thing that used to wake me up at 2 a.m. in a sweat. The other one is the one you mentioned, that events of which we have no control begin to compound themselves, and then you're in the Figge 1995 dilemma. And that would be very difficult. And I can't give you an answer for what to do, because the fact is you don't have control. It's going to have to work its own way out, and then I think you really have a crisis on your hands.
Thank you. Over here.
Yes, I guess this question would be most directly directed towards Congressman Frank, or I'd appreciate comments from Senator Songus also. The U.S.-based manufacturing firms are not doing all that well these days. And in fact, as I think it was Treasurer Malone pointed out, the government now is bigger than our manufacturing base. And people say that's a natural progression to becoming a service economy, but if there's nobody making anything, who are the service people going to be providing services to? I'm wondering what your plan is with a 60% reduction in defense. It seems like pretty drastic, especially considering you were talking about the timeline by 2000. What is your plans? What are you going to do to help help the U.S. manufacturing base keep international competitiveness?
Well, one, I think we should get away from the notion that the federal government has a long-term role as a job bank. And so your linkage of the defense in this seems to me to be a mistake. In the short term, we may want to do a stimulus package at some points. When will always be a debate. But the notion that part of the reason for having more defense spending than we need for national security is for the national economy, I think gets us into trouble, whether it's in the area of defense or in any other area. And I think we have to cut that loose. Secondly, I would say, even in that sense, the first set of cuts I would make in defense have nothing to do with manufacturing here. We are spending $20 or $30 billion a year defending Western Europe against the communist hordes. And my guess is that Germany and France are probably pretty safe now, and we could bring all those troops home. And in fact, stimulate our economy in the short term because they are spending money over there rather than here. Beyond that, I would also say, while the manufacturing decline is a serious problem, I think you may be a little too pessimistic. One of the things that's happening is American manufacturing in some areas is turning around. Some automobiles, for instance, are getting better. The quality is getting better. There's been a very painful reduction in force. We are in a process of a painful adjustment to the international economy. We live in a world where you can make almost anything almost anywhere because of technology and a whole lot of other things. That's caused some problems for us, and I don't think we have dealt socially with the effect of those problems as well as we should. But in terms of our manufacturing, I don't think you can project a continued trend that way because some of it is leveling off. And finally, as to what we would do about it, I think the Clinton administration is right as opposed to the Bush administration and the Reagan administration. The view there was a total laissez-faire. I think the kinds of things that they are talking about in, one, significantly increasing the training of the workforce is very important for manufacturing because that's clearly, I think, Bob Reich's stuff is very important there. And two, trying to work with the high technology field so that you get government cooperation with the right kinds of research also has some promise for what you do in the future.
Thank you. Over here.
My name is Gene Donner. I'm a graduate student at the Harvard School of Public Health. My question involves health care reform and what it means for young Americans in the future. Let's say 20 years from now, how will the health reform activity that's ongoing now affect young Americans 20 years from now? What's your best guess? This is an open question for any of you three.
Could I, since I wrote down my answer to the other, can I run through 6 quickly? On manufacturing, 1, balance the budget, obviously, so you don't kidnap national savings to pay the deficit. 2, a targeted capital gains tax for securities held long term. So you target capital into manufacturing base and its patient capital. 3, eliminate quarterly reporting. So you begin to change the short-term mindset, institute semi-annual reporting, try it for a couple of years, and then if it works, then go to annual reports. Nothing magic about quarterly reporting. 4, pass NAFTA. And it's self-evident. 5, bank regulations. I'm a bank director of Charlotte. I was running for president. I got a letter from the OCC saying that I was now subject to civil penalties because of Charlotte's problems. Charlotte never went under, never was less than $1 billion in equity. So what do you figure out? Well, you figure out very quickly, 1, you don't do a press release on the letter. Second is that the greatest threat to a bank director and a manager of a bank is somebody coming in to borrow money. Because you can be brought into OCC's purview. So what you do is you buy treasuries. So what the government's going to have to do to the regulators is say, someone coming in to borrow money from a bank is not un-American and is not radioactive, and you ought to try to help that person out. Education. There's not much you can do, frankly, at the federal level other than provide college loans that you pay back with a percentage of your income. But at the state level, the 1% increase in the sales tax I mentioned earlier. And finally, I think you're going to see, and John's very active in this, is a gravitation towards a consumption-based income tax that will discourage consumption, encourage savings, so you have a capital pool. And aren't you doing something on that?
Yes, we are. When we're planning a conference on that.
As far as health care is concerned, what I think is going to happen is this. You're going to have a universal coverage plan passed, stripped down, based on the managed competition model, with not the regulation that's been proposed and not the entitlements which have been proposed. Should that not work, it is inevitable, in my view, that you will see a gravitation towards the single-payer Canadian-style system. Because those of us who argue for a managed competition model, who actually put that on the table last year, will have nothing to say. We will have had our chance, didn't work. We gravitate to single-payer. That cannot work. You know, in Canada, they have a very good system, but when they get in real trouble, they come south. Now, I'm not prepared to do that in the United States. That will not work. So what you're going to end up with in the lifetime of most of the people in this room is a serious discussion of the ethics of rationing, which, as you know, many of the European countries have already got to that discussion. But I think that's going to be part of the national debate as the years begin to move on.
I just add one thing. I agree with much of what Paul said on that, but I agree. I think one other asset here, if we get universal coverage, one of the inefficiencies that we now have in the economy, and one of the problems people have, is the fact that your health care is so dependent on your job. The quality of health care you get and whether you get any depends on your job. If you've got a sick kid, if you're ill yourself. One of the great advantages of any form of universal coverage is that cancels out, that people can go back to making job choices purely on the basis of job choices and the economics of it. Healthcare at this point is far too much of a factor in people's job choices, and that's not just a personal problem, it's a source of economic inefficiency.
I think we'll finish up with the three people who are standing, and then we will be finished. So if you could be brief, please.
This question is for Senator Songus. You left me kind of hanging when you talked about raising taxes to deal with education. I think if we were to, by some miraculous means, we're able to take care of the deficit and the debt by the end of this year, I think in 60 years we find ourselves in the same situation. We don't do some things about our educational system. What particular means would you advocate? Maybe you can comment in there on the different types of experiments we've been seeing with for-profit schools and other schools which are directed, for example, toward specifically different minority youth, for example, exclusively black males.
My view is that you've got three issues. One is you don't have the money. And 2.5 did to us what 13 did in California. It squeezed out a lot of waste and a lot of fraud and so forth, but also has now cut. So if you grew up in Wellesley, it's not a problem. You go up in Lawrence, it's a problem. And what I object to strongly about this governor, who I support and virtually everything else, is that you cannot live on Brattle Street in Cambridge, going to Middlesex and then Harvard, and not give a damn about a Hispanic kid in Lawrence. And that's, in fact, what's going on. So money is number one. Secondly, you have to do all the options. Everything I've ever heard about, including what Joe made reference to, I agree with. Let's try everything and see what happens. I tried to put the 1 cent increase on the sales tax on the ballot. You know why we didn't do it? We had all the students actively engaging in signature raising. The unions wouldn't help us. They wouldn't get the money. They wouldn't help us because we had reform in the package. And their attitude was, if you're going to have reform, we don't want the money. So they, lowest common denominator attitude that prevails on the teachers' unions, as Joe points out. So reform is number 2, and experimentation is 3. I think the great challenge before this country is inclusion. The fact is that we have not had the discussion we have to have on what it's like not to be a white, male, heterosexual in this country and feel like you're part of what's going on. And that's what this generation is going to have a discussion about. And the fact is, particularly in the minority community, these kids start way behind the 8 ball and don't have the opportunities. And if anybody thinks they can be safe in Wellesley and Dover, et cetera, and not care about what's happening in the inner cities of this country, they're in for a rude awakening.
Just to follow up on that point, there's the great story about in the days of the Berlin Wall coming down, Time magazine reporter going up to one person after another and asking them how they felt about the wall coming down, and they were saying this is wonderful, it's freedom, it's an opportunity to seek our dreams. Finally, they went to the guard at Checkpoint Charlie, and he said, freedom, freedom, what about my job? And that's the kind of mentality you run into when you try to bring about change, whether it's with the educational system or whether it's with some other bureaucracy. And the only way in which that change can come about is if citizens, in this case parents of students who want a better education system, or people who recognize we're competing in a global marketplace and we better be able to compete on an educational basis, or just people who want a better quality of life, have to apply enough pressure in order to allow some of these pilot programs to take place. Benno Schmidt, the former president of Yale, was in town just recently, and he's talking about his Edison project. And the way that works is they go into a local school committee and they say, pay us on a per student basis what you are currently spending in order to educate a child in your public school system. We will deliver a system that will either be responded to in a favorable way by the consumer out there, the parent and the student, or we will find out very quickly that we've been rejected. I think it's healthy to try that, and I think the end result will be new, innovative ways in which to educate children, and hopefully you will end up with a better public school system. And the only other point I would add to that is they are also pointing out that in 30 years, our public school system has virtually gone unchanged. At the same time, the world around it is changing rapidly. A parent who is a single parent, I'm sure, would love to have the option of leaving his or her child in school until 4 o'clock in the afternoon until their job is done, but that doesn't exist right now. And so all of those kind of ideas need to be put on the table in order to be reviewed to see whether or not they'd work.
Over here.
Congressman Frank, I wonder if you were provided with some more details on the Concord Coalition's Zero Deficit Plan means testing, if you might think differently about it. I worked at the Concord Coalition this past summer on the plan, and when you say that 40,000 is too low an income level to start the means testing,
Not to start it. I didn't. I said. In fact, I voted to start it at a lower level.
right? Well, that is where it starts in the plan. The withholding.
What about the medical part?
That
Where does
too
it start? Yeah.
starts at $40,000 of income for a family. 10% of the entitlement benefits accumulated above that would be withheld. So, for instance, if you were making $50,000 total, 10,000 of which came from entitlement programs, then only 10% of that $10,000, $1,000, would be withheld. Now, if you take into account that only 42% of American families have an income above $40,000, and that it would be indexed from the year that the plan starts, 1995, so that in real dollars it's always 40,000 as of 2 years from now, and only at $120,000 income is it fully in effect at 85% withholding. I wonder if your view might change.
Well, one, to start with, I already voted, as I said, for the tax increase at $25,000 for an individual and $32,500 for a family or for two people. And then we went up to, what, 33 and 40. I'd have to look at the implications of that for Medicare. With regard to the income, and also, I assume, Paul, have you factored in the tax increase? I mean, is this after the tax increase? Mm-hmm. Yes. I guess I don't fully understand how that works. And so if you're asking me if I knew more, would I have a different opinion? The answer is I might, but since I don't know more, I can't tell you what the opinion would be. I mean, and if you're asking me if I can now assimilate everything you just told me and give you an answer, no, I'd want to look at it. But as I said, I have already voted for the principle of doing that, and I like it because I disagree with those who have talked about restricting the cost of living increase. Remember, a large number of older people live on their Social Security, or it's 80 or 90% of what they have. And I think we did a good thing by giving them a cost of living increase. I think they ought to be protected. So I am for the means testing approach. The Social Security, taxing the Social Security was a very efficient way to do it. I know there's also, the efficiency is also approached there. And I've also voted in the past for means testing the Medicare. But I would have to look more clearly at how all these things fit together before I could give you a specific answer.
Last question.
Yes, so my name is Alexander von Bismarck. I will keep this brief. This question is for all of you, especially Representative Frank. To what extent do you think the upcoming decision on NAFTA has to do with today's issue of intergenerational ethics? Specifically, to what extent do you think opposing NAFTA is a sacrifice of future well-being for present jobs?
I don't see it in that context for this reason. I think the debate is not whether we have NAFTA or not, but whether we have this version of it or a different version of it. Because I think if this one does fail, you will see a different version within after the election of a new Mexican president. I think there are what we're fighting about. I think is not whether or not we have free trade with Mexico and ultimately a lot of other places, but what we do within the United States to accompany that. So I don't think that. I mean, I think what we are talking about, what I'm talking about, is dealing with the effects within the country of our adjustment to the international economy. We are adjusting and have to continue to adjust to the international economy. I think we have been too neglectful of the distributional impact of that at home, and I think that lower wage manufacturing workers in particular are entitled to some more cushioning than we've gotten, just as I believe we should do it with regard to the military people as well. So I don't see it as a generational issue in the form in which I think it's going to play out.
It's too bad we have to end up in an area of disagreement because I think Barney's actually both these.
That's all right, Senator. Go ahead.
I was about to compliment you.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
The fact is that it wasn't by accident you chose Barney to be here. I mean, he thinks things through, and we may disagree now and then, but the fact is most of the leadership on the Democratic side is so hidebound on these various issues that you wouldn't have this discussion about the particulars. On NAFTA, I'm strongly supportive. I think that what NAFTA is a step towards is a North American, South American common market. And it just makes a lot of sense that Mexico, Canada, all the way down to Chile is a natural market for us. Will plants go to Mexico if you pass NAFTA? Yes. Will they go if you don't pass NAFTA? Yes. So I take Bonnie out of this comment. What the debate is for most Democrats in Washington is very simple. It's not jobs. I mean, most economists, you have all these presidents for it. Nobody who's been a president is against it. What this is about, very simply, for most Democrats, is where that constituency in our party that has for years provided us with money, workers, love, blood, sweat, tears, etc., can now come back to us and say, okay, folks, here's the bill. And for the unions, this is the test case. This is the bill that comes due. And I think they have a right. I think the unions have poured their soul out for the Democratic Party. They feel very strongly on this issue, trying to protect their constituency. And the fact is that it's going to be a kind of test case for the Democrats, whether we are prepared to say that the national interest is more important than a particular constituency group in our party. Not unlike, by the way, it's sort of the right to life issue is on the Republican side, that there are these constituencies. I would say, finally, that I'm not comfortable with the idea that if this is defeated, that we'll have another one. Can you imagine if we passed it and Mexico didn't, and an American president came back and said, actually, the Mexicans rejected, I'm going to go back and negotiate a better deal for them. That's not how things operate. Plus, you just have a new government taking over in Canada. I think if you kill this thing, it would have a very chilling effect on the economic growth of this country, particularly the manufacturing base. And it is my hope that the Republicans, who have been very responsible, I think, on this issue, will continue to be so, and that the president has been equally responsible on this issue, will garner enough Democratic votes to bring this about. And I applaud Joe Kennedy's decision to support NAFTA. Took all the heat, as you know, from the unions, and that, I think, was a real measure of courage in his own personal growth, and I must say I really found it to be very commendable.
I too support NAFTA, and I just wanted to pick up on the Senator's words about having to buck a core constituency group. It's never easy to do that, but if we're going to end up leaving this country in better shape than we found it, then the political will has to exist in order to take on those special interests. When one goes down to Washington, you see all of the office buildings that seem to be recession-proof. They're all getting their lobbying fees, and they're all working overtime to make sure that real change, the change that people want, doesn't come about, but instead, essentially, the status quo continues to exist. You all can have an impact on making sure this country moves in the direction of the greater good as opposed to the good of some very self-serving thinking special interests. And the other point that I would make is in terms of the question on the deficit that we got earlier as to when this is going to really hit home and explode, we may have already felt some of the explosions. When you see people who are out of work right now, I think if our situation was different in terms of our national debt, you would have seen the equivalent of a Marshall Plan happening in Eastern Europe right now, and America would have a foothold in those countries so that we could export into those countries and bring the kind of services to those countries that would not only advance those countries but also put our people to work. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all. I want to thank our panelists for coming. Thank you, Mr. Frank, Mr. Songus, Mr. Malone. Most of all, I want to thank you for coming and participating. It's really your issue. Thank you very much.
You bet. I guess, yeah.
Not full gram.
Nice to see you. Nice to see you.
Oh, yeah? That's You want him to come, right?
I think I saw her at Cambridge.
Yeah.
Then don't give it to that incident itself.
Yeah, true.
The fact that they couldn't do it. And the fact that one that does, they haven't made up. The fact that one of them show up and do it, like a dictator.
Don't count on Phil. Don't count on Phil Britt. You can count on him, but not for that.
Is it?
Well, it depends also.
Feels like a lot of handmade stuff.
Very I can get you. I don't have any more with me. Right here.
I want to put the name on a card. We'll send it to him.
Okay.
Why don't you fill it out? Jonathan is with the coalition.
John, do you have more plans? They asked, the school asked me not to bring a bunch. That was fine. I guess it's policy, they have no problem.
Who asked you not to bring stuff?
Okay. That's fine. I'll go too.
Catherine, she called down to the forum. They said no.